Today's session is a panel discussion with Judy Davidson, who is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and Kristi Jackson, who is a qualitative senior scientist at Optum. And the session will be facilitated by Silvana Di Gregorio, QSR's research director. And with that, I'll hand over to Silvana.
Thank you, Kristi. So hello, everyone. I'm Silvana, and I'm QSR's research director, and I'm also a sociologist and qualitative researcher. And I have worked in the past, before joining QSR, with our two panelists. Judy and I co-wrote a book and several articles on using software for qualitative analysis, and I have also co-written an article with Kristi Jackson on the same topic. So teamwork with or without software has been an issue we have discussed on many occasions. And it's not just about how to manage teamwork using a software package such as NVivo. It is first and foremost about thinking about doing qualitative research as a team. That is why I have structured this panel with Judy addressing the issues that any team doing qualitative research need to consider, and Kristi to talk about what teams need to consider when using NVivo. So just to let you know that we'll be taking questions at the end of both presentations, but during the presentation, so you don't forget your questions, please write them in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and I'll introduce Judy Davidson, who's Professor of Research and Evaluation in Education at University of Massachusetts Lowell, and she's also author of Qualitative Research and Complex Teams. So over to you, Judy.
Thank you, Silvana. I'm very excited to be here. It's just really great to be able to talk about this book that came out late last year, Qualitative Research and Complex Teams. That's what I'm going to be drawing upon for today's presentation. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So how this work came about and the underlying premise of it is that there's been this myth that qualitative researchers work alone. We do all of our stuff by ourselves. And this myth has shaped the instruction we provide for people. It shapes the instructional materials. It shapes the technologies of research that we use. However, increasingly, the reality is that qualitative researchers work in complex teams. And as a result of this myth, though, that is shaping our assumptions, we are failing to adequately prepare qualitative researchers for their future work and failing to develop the infrastructure that we need to do that work. So these are issues that led me to doing this project and working on this book. Before we get too far along, I'd like to share with you the definition of a complex qualitative research team that I use in this book. The idea is that there are groups, these are groups of 4 or more individuals working together on a research endeavor, can be in one specific geographic location or in virtual space as we are today, or in hybrid circumstances. It's on a defined topic or issue for a specific period of time, and it can employ qualitative research techniques alone, or it can use a mixture of quantitative and qualitative methods. So it took me quite a long time to really recognize the obvious. And even though I had begun early on in my career thinking about collaborative teams, I wrote an article at that came out at the end of graduate school, 1996, The Interpretive Zone, Conceptualizing Collaboration Among Teams of Qualitative Researchers, and I was working with Leora Bressler at the University of Illinois. That ResearchGate tells me people are still reading, and that's where I really started thinking hard about teams. And even though I worked on team projects for the next couple decades, and I even experimented with teaching qualitative research as a team sport, I still had a hard time getting my brain kind of beyond this myth that, oh, we all do it by ourselves, we do it alone. And that was really only my dissertation project. After that, I was doing everything in teams. So what I'm going to be talking about today draws upon the second chapter of the book. And I want to think about 3 specific areas that are really generic for all teams, as Silvana was describing. The first idea is to think about team formation. The second is to think about research design and project organization. And the third then is how do we put it all together with a digital toolkit. So that's where I'm headed today. So let's start with team formation. An area that I think is just critical to explore are really the assumptions that bring together a team and that underlie the perspectives of team members. And through exploring this, you should be able to get to the place where you can develop a dissemination plan, which I feel is essential for every team to head towards. So let's think before we do that, though, and I think it's important to bolster yourself as a qualitative researcher to think about what are the valuable qualities I'm going to bring to this team. Well, you can tell yourself you value diversity and difference. You are willing to go beneath the surface and think about the deep issues. You know a lot about writing and the writing tasks in research, and you respect process as practice. Now, the reason I emphasize this and say go in with a positive attitude is because you can face a lot of challenges as a qualitative researcher on a diverse team, because qualitative research has been historically marginalized. You can't ignore that. Other team members may lack adequate understanding of aspects of the research approach you're using. And certainly when they outsource the qualitative research and say, here, you guys do this, come back and tell us your findings, you might miss the opportunity to be able to share with others and help them to better understand what you do and how you do it. So just some things to think about before you dive into the deepest discussions about assumptions. So when a team is starting out, which is when you ask people about, gee, how did you get together? How did this team form? It sounds a lot like a TV show that would have been called How We Met. But you may find on your team that you have similarities with others from different parts of the team because you're in the same role. Maybe you're both newbies, project research assistants, or maybe you're both team leaders. That can be shared and different. You may find out that your disciplinary affiliation draws you together, or there may be differences there. You're a biologist, the other person is a political scientist, you have a business person on there. So your discipline can divide you or bring you together. And of course, methodological affiliation, whether or not you're a statistician, whether you're a qualitative researcher with a particular perspective, these things might drive understanding. And very important is person and culture. Your gender affiliation, your culture, your ethnicity, your language, all of these things may bring things to the table that are resources or challenges for you. As you are thinking about, as you are discussing these assumptions and how you fit together, 3 rules I think that are very important to keep in mind are, first, don't assume that everyone in the room is working on the same set of principles. That doesn't mean that there are good and evil people in this room, but that you really have different ideas of what is the best way to do things, perhaps. You can't assume that everyone feels they can speak freely and openly. And this could come from a variety of reasons. But people may not feel immediately that they have the right to share openly, and you may need to figure out what those differences are. And you can't assume that everyone's hearing the same thing. I'm sure you've all been in a place where you know these words were uttered in front of me and in front of you, but you understand them totally differently. That happens quite a bit. And so these are all things that will make the assumption period, the team formation period, something that needs process. But once you've worked through that, it should give you the background to help you craft a dissemination agreement that you can refer to and update as you need to. And this is something that needs to follow you throughout the project to make you safe, really, as a researcher, and to make everyone on the project safe with each other. You have to think about who owns the data and what does that mean. If the project is supported by a funder, you have to think about what they mean. What requirements do they have for the protection and the dissemination of data and findings? Who are the critical gatekeepers who will be involved in making decisions about the use of the data or the findings? What rights and responsibilities do different people have on the project? And depending upon the complexity of the project, the dispersal of people, this could be quite complicated. What's the process for a project member to follow when you want to use data in some way, when you want to talk about the work? And who should review documents finally to make these decisions? These are some of the things that a dissemination agreement will help you get started with. And this is going to be important to what comes next, which is thinking about the research design and the project organization. Actually, they're probably happening kind of at the same time. But with the research design, there are 4 critical decisions that I see need to be made. First, you have to establish the expectations for preliminary and ongoing documentation. And I put this more in the administrative set of things. Secondly, you've got to select the methods of inquiry, the instrumentation. And third, this will be new for some of you. Certainly, I found it to be a new area to think about. You have to integrate the research design with your long-term data archiving plan. So you put this all together, and then you know you've got to have a project management system that uses a digital toolkit approach. And I'll probably say this now and later. It used to be that when we thought about software and qualitative research, we thought, oh, qualitative data analysis software, that's it. Not anymore. Things are far more complex. We live in a digital society, and to do all of these things, we actually have to have a digital toolkit and a system for managing that. So the 2 areas that will probably seem more familiar to you are in the next slide, the documentation and the instrumentation. The documentation is more the administrative idea of who's going to document what, when, how do we do that, where does it go, who can access that, how do we organize the repositories of our notes, what tools will make this easier. The instrumentation refers more to how we actually do the research. And in qualitative research, that's going to mean tools to capture the information through perhaps interviews, observations. So do we need, audio storage, video storage? What conventions will we use for identifying these materials and managing them? How are we going to check and review and make improvements in the ways that we're capturing information? So those are things that we pretty much, in all sorts of research worlds, we agree to. But what is new for qualitative researchers in many cases is the idea of archiving. And quantitative researchers have done this for some time, and it makes sense. You spend a lot of time and effort trying to get that stuff, and then you've got it. Well, wouldn't someone else maybe want to use it too? Wouldn't that make it, more efficient? We've been a little bit later to that game, and there are now a number of archives that have set up ways of doing this for qualitative researchers. One of the issues had been for us was that the technical requirements were different. For instance, how would you store the data itself, and would you store it with the tool that you were using to manage the data? And some of those problems are being solved. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a couple of the archives that are available now and that have developed different protocols for saving this data. And we're only at the beginning now, but it will continue. And at least in the US, we have several governmental agencies that are now requiring this. So it's going to go forward, we know that. But as I said before, you have all this stuff, and now you got to think about, okay, how am I going to manage all of this? And that's when you have to think about the project management system and a digital toolkit approach. It's critical in teamwork, because certainly more, whether it's good or not, more team members make more stuff. On a team, all members will have to get some kind of access. That means that you need good organizational tools, and in a digital world, those are digital. Teams are going to have to review, add, and change tools as needed. And teams have to be flexible, working with the digital constraints of all members. And that can be significant as you cross national borders, even work with different parts of a country. And that's really important. So finally, heading into the components of a digital toolkit, I divide them into 3 areas, 3 sets of tools. One is for communication and project management. Another is for data and literature collection. And the third is for qualitative research data organization and management. In the first area, I mean, synchronous and asynchronous communication tools may have to be found. It may not be that easy in all cases to work together. We need project planning tools, digital storage, and tools to support the collaborative writing. Under data collection, there are a number of tools that we use, digital tools we use to collect the data, but I also consider the literature to be data. And so reference managers, web clipping, and note-taking tools are very important there. But the tool that we have always considered to be at the heart of this is qualitative data analysis software, and it's still pretty darn important, I think. And so this will help us to organize, visualize, to probe materials, but these tools will have to be integrated with the other tools that we use. So that's something that is a big thing to think about. As I send this off to Kristi Jackson, who is going to be our next speaker, just in terms of qualitative data analysis software, I'd like you to think about these things. What tools can you and your partners access? This is getting easier because file exchange is getting easier, but it's something very important to consider. Also, are senior team members willing to develop adequate skills in whatever tool you choose to oversee the project work? And does your team possess, or can it get, advanced expertise in research design in qualitative data analysis software, in the tool that you selected? I've seen many doctoral projects where people have done wonderful work in a software that is code and retrieve, but they could have done so much better and had so much more flexibility if they'd had more expertise available in research design. So I know that Kristi is going to be thinking about those things and talking about them to you in the next part of this presentation. So thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you, Judy. So now I'd like to introduce Kristi Jackson, who's the lead author of Qualitative Data Analysis with NVivo. And she will focus in on how teams can use NVivo to support their work. I should say that she's also a long-time NVivo trainer and consultant running her own company, Query, and she's currently qualitative senior scientist at Optum, where she leads studies in patient-reported outcomes. So I'll hand it over to you, Kristi.
Thank you so much. So I also wanted to acknowledge that some of the material I will be talking about is from our newly released Qualitative Data Analysis with NVivo, and I want to acknowledge my co-author, Pat Baisley. And also an innovative part of this next edition, this third edition, is that we had roughly 17 trainers and consultants who are experts around the world to help us with this. So it was a great collaborative effort, and it taught me a lot about teamwork, kind of in a new way in thinking about qualitative data, and helped inform some of this. And the final chapter in the book is about teamwork. So some of the things I will be talking about, I'll be pulling from that chapter, but I will also cover some additional things and other perspectives. So for you, just to get a little grounding in my history, which is our next slide here, there's quite a bit of things going on here because I've had quite a wandering path through my career. So I've studied anthropology and comparative religious studies and got a degree in higher ed administration and worked in universities and colleges in the United States for a while, which means I have a focus on education and an eye towards what it means to learn and the different ways we learn, and got a PhD in foundations in education as a culmination of that journey. But I'm also trained as an evaluation researcher and worked for an evaluation research firm. As Silvana mentioned, I've done a lot of qualitative research consulting, especially with NVivo, for about the last 20 years. And I've recently joined Optum in patient-reported outcomes, which is a whole new world for me and has really also opened my eye to some of the diversity, both in teams and in the way qualitative research unfolds. And if you, after this session, were to Google patient-reported outcomes or cognitive debrief interviews, you'll crack open potentially a new way of looking at the way qualitative research is conducted and the ends to which it's designed. So I just wanted to make sure you know that I'm coming from a pretty broad range of perspectives, some of which conflict and some of which really enhance each other. And I just want to be transparent about the way I'm thinking about things. So to move on, just to give you an overview of the presentation, I am going to first talk about some nuts and bolts. So the project format, the types of projects that you can create and the ways you can share them as teams are often just technical issues that people want to know out of the gate, and also the tools that are specifically designed for teamwork. And this is going to be more technical. I'm going to go through several technical issues about the software that teams might want to know, and I want to do that to kind of help you because there are frequent questions that come up, but also just to get it out of the way so that you have that grounding. So then I can talk about some of the diversity of issues that go on with teams and how those might manifest themselves in organizing an NVivo project or an NVivo database. And that's sort of carrying on from a lot of the things that Judy just mentioned. And then I'm going to return to some commonalities. So within that diversity and the different ways people might use it or approach it, there are some just good global practices that I want to make sure I end with. So if we move on, the first thing I wanted to talk about are these types of projects. So you have a couple ways you can work in teams in an NVivo project. You can do a single standalone project that might be handed off. So people are working sequentially, they aren't working concurrently, and it's always on one project. That often isn't practical. So other people get NVivo for Teams, which allows for synchronous use. People can actually be coding in the same project at the same time. And for others, they use one of the other versions of NVivo that's a standalone version of the software, but you can actually make copies of a project. So just to give you a quick visual of how that third one works, it seems to be, in my experience, the most common. What you'll have is the first project, which will be project A. And you'll make a copy of that project, right? So if you and I are working on the same team, we make a copy and we'll end up in project B. So now I have a copy on my computer, for instance, you'll have a copy on your computer. once we've done work, we'll merge those back together. And that means importing project A back into, project B back into project A, and you have a brand new project C. So for obvious reasons, you want to make copies first because you'll be permanently changing project A. So when you do this in teams, you want to create copies, work on them, and then create an archive before you merge, so you can always go back to those original copies. I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but it's one of the first technical issues that people are concerned about. So I just wanted to make sure I shared that. So now let's talk about tools that are specifically designed for teamwork in NVivo. I'm going to talk about a few things. One is why you might want a prompt for the user. So change the software default so that it's asking who's in the project at the time. I'll talk about users and passwords, and then again, combining projects and some rules about combining projects. So the prompting for user on launch is actually not the default. So here's a quick screenshot. All these will be fairly quick, and they're not hard to do, but sometimes people don't know where these things are. So when you go to the File and Options, to get to the application options, you'll go to the General tab, and in that General tab is a checkbox that asks you to prompt for the user on launch. And that's the box kind of in the middle of that screen. So when you create a new project or when you install the software, you might ask for it to do this by default. But if you don't, you'll have to tell NVivo to do it. Now, the reason you want to do this is evidenced in the next slide, and that is a list of nodes or codes in your project. I'm kind of assuming some foundational knowledge that you might have in the software or this kind of software, but here's a list of nodes or of codes that are in your project. And what you see here in the columns are a created by and a modified by, which tells us who did what and when they did it. Or I should say who at least created it or most recently modified it. So when you prompt for user, if for instance we've merged projects or we're working in one project that we're handing off, by prompting for user, NVivo always knows who's doing the work. And even if you code the same passage to the same node, it will only be there once, but you'll get some information where you can see who did what. So it's a good idea to change that default just to make sure you don't lose track of who's engaging in those activities. Okay, so the next issue is a project log. So in the next slide, again under project properties and under the general tab, there's an option to go to write the user actions to the project event log. So that checkbox that's in the middle of the left-hand side of that screen will make sure that a log gets created of who's doing what when. And in the next slide, there's a list of that log. So it's providing for you the name of the item, where it is, what the event was that was done to it. Was it coding? Was it created? Was it modified? And then also who did it. This doesn't allow you direct access back to that moment so you can change things, but it does give you a log so you can see who did what. It's helpful for people who are managing teams to see who's been in the project, what time they've been in the project, and the kinds of activities they've engaged in. And it's a good troubleshooter if something goes wrong and you want to go back to an archived copy to re-import a memo that you might have accidentally deleted or any of those things. Okay, so there's the project event log. And then the next thing is passwords. So in the project properties window, there's an option for passwords for teams. You can also use this if you're an individual, but if you're wanting to give somebody access to read and write, so actually to change the project, there's an area for that. And there's also an area where you can have read-only passwords. So you're giving somebody access to look at the project. They can move around in it, they can open codes, they can read things, but they can't alter anything. Okay, so that might be a password situation that you might be interested in. And now I want to get to the last technical issue here, and that's combining projects. So here's the same visual. You have a project A, you make a copy of it, then you'll end up with a project B, and when those two different projects have work completed in them, you'll import B into A and have a new project C. There are some rules to make sure that this works properly. So the rules entail, if we go to the next slide, let's say we have a series of nodes, okay? So here's a substructure. Let's say this is my project, and I have a node for activities, and I have subnodes for meetings and phone conferences. And then if we look at your structure, you might have nodes that are similar. And so if we click forward, we'll see that list of nodes. And so you'll see these are close, but they're not identical. Well, when you merge into a new coding structure, what happens is, if we just look at these two top tree substructures, the final resulting merged project will have all of the nodes. So you'll see under activities, we have meetings and phone conferences and projects. So NVivo didn't ignore anything, it combined everything. And that's the ideal, that's what you want. Nothing gets missed, everything that is a duplicate gets combined. So what is a duplicate? There are 3 rules for making sure your duplicates merge. First, they have to have the same name. So if you have a node for trusting or work or love in one project, they have to be named similarly in the other. Same with files or classifications or sets or other items in the project. They also have to be in the same hierarchical position. So if I have a node for trusting and it's under themes, and you have a node for trusting and it's under teamwork, those 2 nodes won't merge. So the same kind of hierarchical path inside the project. And then finally, when it comes to your files, your interview transcripts, for instance, there has to be an exact match in the text within those files. So even a simple change of 2 letters will prevent those files from merging. So it's really important that team members know when they're working in copies of projects not to edit the text of the data so that those files merge. So you don't have 2 copies of Susan or 2 copies of Dorothy. Okay, so now that we've gotten through, I think, the most technical issues that people are interested in, let's talk about diversity in team contexts. So what I'm going to talk about are ranges, and I'm really not going to be able to get through all 10, which is my plan from the beginning, but we'll talk about a few of them in detail, and then I'm going to just point to some of the others, because I want to make sure you don't end up in a cookie cutter approach with the software. And this is pulling from a lot of the great lessons that Judy just gave you about things you have to consider when you're in a team. So let's start with comparing coders. So what we have in the next slide is a node that's open. So this node is actually in the sample project that comes with the software. And this is the node for local identity. And what you see on the right-hand side are coding stripes that are open according to the coder. So remember in the earlier slide, I showed you that when you prompt for the user, NVivo will show you who did what, but things don't get duplicated. Well, here's a great example. So this first paragraph that's in the node for local identity, both Effie, who's EDR, and Wanda, who's WWS, coded this material to that node. So we're turning on these stripes by who did the work. Part of the reason I want to talk about this as part of the range of diversity of how you want to think about leveraging tools in the software, I've seen quite a few teams use this strategy as a way of talking and communicating and unearthing the deep meaning and challenging each other and coming to better understandings. And it's not about a coder reliability test. It's not about making sure everybody's doing the exact same thing. It's about moving researchers forward in the way they're thinking about data. Granted, you could compare who did what with some of these stripes, but for some of you who've done this before, it's quite a different feeling when you go through a transcript line by line as a team and talk about where you'd code things versus go into a node or go into a theme and have all of you talk about what you see collectively that you thought belonged in that theme. It's kind of a different activity. Some teams will find this very helpful, and for others, it's not precise enough as a way of comparing. So in the next slide, I'm going to the other end of the spectrum. There are tools in the software, and this is from the Windows version, although the Mac version has a similar tool, that lets you do a coding comparison query. And what I'm going to try to do in this slide is help explain these numbers, which is also a technical issue people often come up against and want to know how it works. So what you'll see at the bottom of the screen is a sample of a transcript. And it's not important that you'll be able to read that. I just want you to see that that's text that you could read. And if we then look at the brackets that are to the left of that transcript, let's say I coded that material to a particular node, but the bracket that's on the outside, the smaller bracket, you coded to the node. Well, if we're measuring Kappa score, then by one more click forward, the places that, I'm sorry, let's start with the agreement score. You'll see the places that we agreed are everything that's green on the screen. So the very first 3 lines, we basically agreed to code that to the node. And the remaining material, we agreed to not code to the code. And if we think of it as a Kappa score instead, if we go one more click forward, oh, sorry, let's go one more click back. The Kappa score is actually considering just what we coded. So if you look at the 2 top brackets, the first full bracket coded more than the second outer bracket where one of us coded. So the agreement score here is being calculated, or the Kappa score, excuse me, is being calculated at the character level. So you want to be mindful that while it will count it, while it will look at it, while it will give you some measurements, there's a lot of different ways to interpret this. And in this chapter of the book, the teamwork chapter, we go into more detail about being cautious about using this as a measurement of how good the work is. But you'll see this is quite a bit different than the earlier image I had up of a node with coding stripes by researcher. And if actually you were to double click on this line where there's an arrow, we go to the next slide where you'll see you can actually get to that data. So here's a piece of Barbara where 2 different coders have coded to habitat. So the orange stripe would have represented that longer bracket that I had in the prior screen, and the blue stripe represents the shorter bracket. So for some people, this is more about becoming reliable and having the conversation and drilling into the data rather than measuring it. So that's a lot of different things that I just went through. You can either become more deeply involved in the data through the communication and looking at what coders did. You could try to measure it with a coder reliability test, or you could use these tools not as a strategy for measuring, but as a strategy for becoming reliable. And those are all 3 very different things that you might want to do in the software. Okay, so now let's move on. One of the things I wanted to give you caution about around coder reliability is that if you move to reliability too quickly and all you want to do is measure it, you could be sacrificing validity because you could be all getting reliable around exactly the wrong concepts. So be careful about moving to reliability without realizing that what you're engaging in is hegemonic coding. That is, whoever has the loudest voice or whoever the PI is who says this is how we'll do it could be sacrificing ways that you see the data in a valid way rather than a reliable way. And those other things that are listed at the bottom are often what qualitative research journals want to know, or what dissertation committees want to know. How's the system developed, and what was it that convinced the team of conclusions, or convinced you of conclusions if you're working alone? Were there competing explanations? How are differences resolved? Most of the really good qualitative researchers that I know are more interested in those 4 questions than they are in measurements of reliability. Okay, so let's go on to the next one, and these next ones will go a little bit more quickly. I think there's a fewer things to talk about. So in team communication, you can use memos in the software to communicate with each other, but you might do that kind of communication in an awful lot of different ways. So here we have a memo on the right-hand side, and if you put in these standard labels in your memos, you can actually use NVivo's tool to autocode to create a node for each of those things. So if there's 5 people or 10 people on your team, you could go into the node for questions about coding when you're in a team meeting to see all the questions that came up while people were coding. So this is a really cool way to communicate in a team by using memos. But I want to draw your attention to all the different heading levels that I put in here. So questions about coding is very much a process issue, right, where you're trying to get clear on the coding. Initial interpretations is actually about hypothesizing and thinking about the data and what does it mean. Suggestions for interviewers is about collecting the data. And ideas for conference presentation is narrowing down your view because you know you need a conference material collected soon and you want to make sure you get those ideas in one place. Well, those are all really different things that you want to think about. So as a team, it's good to think early on about what are the kinds of things you want people writing about because of the things that you need to do next in the process. The things at the bottom of this screen are much more practical, and I wanted to leave them here just because they fit in with team communication. When you create annotations in the software, which are like comments in Microsoft Word, you might want to put the author's initials next to the annotation so you quickly know who wrote them. And then the colors for team member work will help you see, because you can add colors to nodes, you can add colors to memos, will help you see who did what work. So those are just two sort of technical tips at the end of team communication. And as Judy mentioned, you don't want to assume everybody understands the same thing. And by forcing yourself to really articulate what some of these issues are, you'll be able to communicate better. All right, so then the next range or thing to think about has to do with coding structures. And so I recommend that you create a node or a folder for each team member to allow for new ideas without going too far astray. So what we have here is a list of nodes. And what you'll see is I've created an area called Z coders. Just put the Z in there so it would stack at the bottom, although you can custom sort these in other ways if you want. And there's a node for me and a node for my colleague Susan. Well, here in this area, I can create a new node for a new concept. But what I haven't done is created new nodes in the main coding structure because that makes it confusing for everybody when it comes to merging the projects again. Remember, when the projects merge, nothing will get ignored. So in the range of needing to have a very standard structured coding structure versus everybody can do whatever they want, what I've pointed to here is kind of the happy medium in that range, which may or may not be helpful because, again, you might be somewhere else in the range, but it's a suggestion people often don't think about until they're far along in their teamwork. So new ideas can go under somebody's personal area of the tree, and when the coding structure gets merged, everybody can look at their proposals, and as a team meeting, you can decide what goes in the final coding structure. Okay, so that takes me to my next slide about all the other ways that there are ranges, and I'm not going to go through these in detail. Actually, Judy talked about quite a few of these, but you do want to think about methodologies, geography, ethical issues, how people will work together or independently, access to the software, experience with qualitative methods or with NVivo, because that could influence how you work as a team, and decision-making models. Are you using consensus? Is there a team leader who gets to direct decisions? All of these things are going to affect how you use some of these tools. Okay, so to wrap up, I just have some global suggestions. One of those global suggestions is to pilot things. Prepare one document and import it rather than all 40. Ask different researchers to code a page of a transcript, not 4 transcripts. Practice combining the project, practice seeing visual comparisons. All the things that you are thinking about doing to the whole project, you should do a little pilot of first. It will save you tons of time in the end. All right, so the next tip on the next slide is to write. So we always want to write in those memos. There could be a lot of different things people decide to write in those team memos, but if you don't write at all, it's just a huge mistake. Ideas will come and go. You won't keep track of the evolution of your thinking, and you can write about lots and lots of different things. And so here is just an example of the different things you could write about. And then finally, the last global takeaway is to assess the strengths on the team, and not just to assess the strengths, but how they change. So Judy mentioned valuing diversity is so important in a team project, and being aware that people have different signals around when it's okay to talk and when it's okay to share and when it's okay to disagree. But there are also technical strengths and strengths around ways of seeing data or visualizing data or getting good rapport in the field. It's really important to honor some of those strengths in the team and give people room to apply them. But it's also a characteristic of a good team to see those things grow and change over time and give people an opportunity to switch what they're doing, to move to new areas. And it's that engagement and that satisfaction with being in a team that is more likely to yield really high quality research. Okay, so I went through a few things there. Some of them, again, were technical and just had to do with the things I get asked all the time about how teams can manage their work in the software. And some of them are much more conceptual and I think flowed directly out of Judy's great ideas, which is not a surprise because we worked together before and we think a lot alike. So once again, I just want to thank my co-author and the contributors to the book, and you'll learn more in the team chapter. All right, so with that, Silvana, I hope I'm not too winded to hand it over to you.
No, thank you very much, Kristi. There's a lot of information there. So if we just move to the next slide. Right, so what I've done here is just to jog everyone's memory, because we've covered a lot of topics, both Judy and Kristi have here. And we do have some questions waiting to be answered. But what I'd like to do is sort of like first, start in terms of the general issues about qualitative researchers working in teams, and just remembering what Judy talked about. The issues first about forming a team, and then looking at research design, the importance of thinking about archiving nowadays, and the kind of digital toolkit that you might have. And I just want to throw out this question for Judy, but Kristi can ask it. Is that what is the most common mistakes have you come across with people working in teams?
I'll let you start,
Silvana,
Judy.
Now that what is the most common mistake? I think I would say, what mistake haven't I made? Kristi did such a good job of outlining the technical piece of merging projects. I have done everything possibly wrong with merging projects, trying to work. I remember one specific project trying to work with a team on that, and I wished I'd had Kristi's expertise at that point. And that's why I want to reiterate that if you don't have the research design expertise, go get it, because it'll save you a lot of time and energy. I think one of the things is not asking for help when you need help is probably a really big problem. And there's lots of good help in NVivo. You have good documentation, and it's gotten better over the years too. So that's a good place to go, but you do need to explore those, how does the tool work, and make sure that everyone can get access to the pieces that it needs and the information they need to use those pieces.
Yeah, and I would I agree with everything, Judy, that you just said, and I would also say that some people just don't, I think it's an implicit understanding, but it needs to be made explicit that, right, the benefit of being in these teams is that you get to talk and you get to articulate things, and you have to work through verbally or in writing why you're making the moves that you're making. And the reality is we should be doing that when we're working independently, but we often don't. So what happens when you're in a team is these split-second decisions sometimes, or these fairly quick decisions, turn into things that take a much longer time because you're forced to articulate it to your colleagues. And that's fantastic. It's fantastic for the research. It's fantastic for you. It's fantastic for the team. but failing to realize that that's what's going to happen can create really quick frustration around how fast things are moving. And people who've worked alone for a while, when they switch to this, will feel this frustration and feel a sense of we're not doing enough and we're not doing it fast enough. And it's just imperative to think about the timelines in advance and let go of that, because what you're gaining is far more valuable usually than the rapid work independently where you're failing to articulate why you're thinking what you're thinking.
Right. So communication is really key. And I mean, Judy mentioned about, we're not trained, in your PhD, you're the lone researcher, about, as you say, communicating everything, those quick decisions. I just want to make one more question for both of you. You both mentioned diversity in teams. And I don't know if you want to comment a bit further about that.
This is Judy. I just want to go back to that slide mentally to the slide where I was talking about when you go, you're a qualitative researcher, you're going to join a team, give yourself a pep talk. Remind yourself of why you are as good as you are and what you bring. Because, and it's many times, it's not people are trying to constrain you. They're not thinking bad things about you, but they simply don't understand your world as a qualitative researcher. So you do bring diversity to the table in that writing is the way that you want to approach things. You want to document things that way. That you honor process, that you don't feel that process is always a waste of time. That you do want to dig deep, as Kristi was describing, to think about, well, why did we make that decision? How did we come to it? What were how can we unpack that? You've got excellent skills in that. If you've been trained as a qualitative researcher, that's what you bring that to a team. And so you want to be ready to give that when you join the team. And I've been very lucky to work on teams with people of diverse methodological and disciplinary backgrounds who thought so differently from me, but allowed me to be the qualitative researcher that I was hoping I could be. And that's really a wonderful opportunity. And I think if you find yourself in a position where you can't do that, you need to probe and say, and to get the team to discuss why that's not happening. So communication is essential. Yes.
Very good advice. And I would also say that, I think of a lot of the things we've talked about today are diversity issues that occur in a wide range of settings, whether you're working on a community project or a work group that isn't doing qualitative research, or a family reunion, that you've got people coming together to get things done. And we often think of things like cultural diversity and gender diversity and all the other ways we talk about diversity. But what I've experienced with teams in qualitative research is that a whole new set of diverse issues come up that sometimes people aren't expecting, like some people are very comfortable being very descriptive with codes and don't want to veer at all from what participants say, and other people are really comfortable pushing some interpretations, making some hypotheses that might not hold true, but we're not afraid to go there and look at it. Some people want to code very precise, small pieces of data. Other people want to code lots of context. Some people are really good at thinking about data by visualizing and drawing and mapping, and other people want to read and write and outline. And so there's just all these other ways of handling data that will start becoming apparent that are new ways of being diverse. And because you haven't maybe been in that context before, there can be sometimes an inclination to get frustrated that it's not going the way you think it should go, the way we should handle this data. And it's important to let go a little of that and realize we have diversity in how we handle information. And that shows in other ways as we handle and think about information, and that's going to affect how your team works together. So just a tip.
Right, thank you. So we have some questions here, and Yvette has a good question here. You know, what's the best way to onboard new team members who don't have experience with NVivo? Are there any specific training opportunities you recommend?
Well, I would definitely say training is helpful, and somebody who just has a basic understanding of the software but hasn't taught it before could use a little extra help, because using it and understanding how to communicate it in a training setting are different things. QSR has a ton of resources on their website. There are consultants and trainers that are around the world that can help you virtually or in person. And there's an excellent book by Jackson and Baisley that you could also purchase that has online resources as well on the web that could be helpful for teaching and thinking about things like coding structures.
Right.
I can second that. My students like Jackson and Bailey's work, Baisley's work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point what Kristi says is that if you're the project manager and you might have used NVivo but not a team to get some support, a consultant, because it is a different way of working as opposed to if you're a lone project. I have another question here from Amir, who wants to know about the technical managing of a project in NVivo, such as logging, prompting usernames, determining passwords. He wants to know whether the Mac version has the same functions.
Oh, and Silvana, I might get your help on that because it's been a while since I've opened my Mac version. I mean, a month, so sometimes I forget these things if I'm not in them every day. I think they are all very similar. The thing that comes to mind is that the coding comparison query gives you more parameters that you can select. So instead of counting on the character level, you can ask it to count at the paragraph level or the sentence level. Is there anything else you would add to that, Silvana? Oh, we might have lost her.
Okay, I think we've lost Silvana there. So there's a couple of more questions. We have 2 minutes left. So it sounds like we might have Silvana back. Sorry, Silvana?
Oh. I can't unmute. Right. Sorry.
We can hear you, Silvana.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh,
yeah.
I had a problem unmuting myself. Sorry. Great. Right.
Is there anything else you'd want to add, Silvana, about the Mac Windows differences on the technical issues of prompting for users and passwords?
Well, you get the same thing in terms of the having the coding start with the username, and you're right in terms of the coding comparison query is actually better in the Mac because you have more control over at what level it's comparing, is it the character level or is it word level? I'm not quite sure about passwords, whether the password for the anonymous password exists. But yeah. Carol wants to know if you started a project without, the rules that Kristi, that you mentioned in terms of naming and comment. I don't know whether Carol meant, logging in as, with your initials as a team maker, as a team member, every time you're working in NVivo. She wants to know how can you and your teammate edit, change what's already been done in NVivo. And yeah, basically you can't. Can you can start from you can decide, okay, from now on we're going to log in with our team member's name, and then from that point on it will be recording. But if you didn't do it from the beginning, you can't really do that. You can, if you've been writing memos, you can sort of go back and say whose memo is what and add your initial. I don't know, Kristi or Judy, if you have anything more about that.
No, if I understand the question correctly, yep, that's the other issue might be that I sometimes encounter people who have entered themselves under 2 different initials, so I might put myself in as KJ one time and KAJ another time, and you can change those, so you can merge different users' work, but you can't go the other way around.
Yeah. Right. Oh, this is a related one from Stuart. How does the merge process affect the project log? If 2 people did different things in their copy of the project at the same time, what happens when the projects are merged?
So in the project log, I think the prior activities will still show the other initials, but moving forward, since you're now in one project, if you're working in one, it will just have one person's initials. So I have worked with teams who simply merge for the sake of running coder comparison queries or doing other things, but then go back to their independent projects or create copies of the newly merged project and work in those. But a quick little pilot. So remember, one of my big tips was piloting. If you were just to create 2 projects and do a few little things in them and go through these steps, by visualizing it and seeing it, you'll understand the mechanics and it'll give you a path for moving forward.
Right. I think that's just for one more question. What if you're working with a bilingual team? Is NVivo able to analyze 2 languages within a single project that can be analyzed with multiple users? And what are the limitations with NVivo when working with bilingual text? Have you had experience of either of those?
Yeah, I have. You know, so NVivo, not only can you use any digital language, you know, for instance, that Microsoft might have, you can import those languages, you can code in them, but you can also change the software to different language bases. So the way it searches for text and the way it sees synonyms in a language, it has those capabilities. The difficulty is actually the human difficulty of interpreting the information, and are the researchers bilingual, or is it text that's been translated for the purpose of the researcher? And those are the difficult things to think through, and how it changes the way you want to format the documents, etc. But I think, again, a quick pilot of the kind of data that you'll be handling and what you want out of it will quickly reveal the things that you can do. I don't know if you want to add to that, Silvana or Judy.
Judy, I just wanted to say that I think that this was an excellent question. I haven't had experience with it, but I think that another issue would also be whether or not they're going to outsource the materials, because sometimes it's like being a qualitative researcher. Are you going to put all the Spanish materials, give them over to some group, and then not have the communication about what's actually in that pile? How would you do that?
Yep, that's a challenge. Translation is always a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to have some agreement in terms of, you know, when you merge, I mean, the naming, the names of codes, for example, and we all know in terms of some conceptual ideas don't translate across, you know, different languages, and so you'd have to use, you know, the language that for that concept. But I think overall, if you're going to be writing together, you need to have some, and there'll also be codes that are the same. So, I mean, if you want it to merge together, you might have to agree, okay, we're just going to use the French terms for the codes and just use some English codes where the English is better for capturing the essence of that idea, or vice versa. But yeah, it needs a lot of sort of talking through. Okay, so I think we've just gone over time, so I just want to thank Judy and Kristi for this great presentation, and we will answer. We haven't been able to go through all the questions, but we'll email you answers to that. I think the last slide will just show contact information. If we can move to the last slide, if you want to contact either Judy and Kristi, and I totally recommend both their books. Judy's book on teamwork, complex teams, and Kristi and Pat Baisley's book that's just come out. So it's for the latest version, up to date, the latest version of NVivo 12, both for Windows and Mac. Really, for those of you who really want to get to grips with using NVivo. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. And yeah, a huge thank you to our panelists, Judy and Kristi, for taking the time to be part of today's webinar, and also to you, Silvana, for leading this discussion. We'll wrap up this webinar now, so we hope that everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.